partially alluded to our next speaker, Arnie Valdez, so I'll invite him up. Arnie received his master's in architecture from the University of New Mexico and was selected for the Loeb Fellowship at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. He spent a year in residence in Cambridge studying landscape architecture and ecology. Returning to New Mexico, he became a professor at UNM teaching alternative construction and cultural landscape studies. Arnold Valdez trained as an architect and has 15 years experience working with local government as a land use planner and as administrator in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. While working in Castilla and Conejos counties, he assisted in completing the adoption of comprehensive land use plans, zoning regulations, administering land use regulations, and code enforcement. While working as a senior planner for the Santa Fe County from 2007 to 2012, Mr. Valdez participated in the development of the Sustainable Growth Management Plan. In addition to planning-related work, Mr. Valdez is a partner in Architectural Harmonics, a firm specializing in sustainable building and landscape design. He's currently serving as a cultural landscape consultant for the Bureau of Land Management, Taos Field Office, and Argonne National Labs. He's assisting the BLM with the San Luis Valley Taos Plateau Cultural Landscape Assessment to provide a foundation for land management actions and regional mitigation planning with regard to proposed large-scale photovoltaic solar applications on public lands.
Buenos días de Dios. Good morning, everybody. Definitely the legacy lives on in New Mexico. But what about Colorado? That was a question that was asked to me when I was teaching at UNM and in all my work in New Mexico. People wanted to know what are the state of the Acequias in Colorado. So upon my leaving of my post at UNM and my job in Santa Fe and returning back to San Luis, I decided to explore it a little bit further. I had actually been thinking about writing a book with the late Esteban Arellano, one of the solar pioneers in New Mexico, was contributed greatly to the Acequia culture and has written a book called Enduring Acequias to the UNM Press. So we started working on it, and then he passed away in 2014, so that kind of put that aside. But I continued my hopes that someday I would be able to develop a book or draw, manuscript. So last year I had the opportunity to visit with one of my professors from UNM Press. And actually, I'm really very excited and grateful for all the contributions of all of the authors and the people that appeared in RC's film. Many of them were my professors at UNM, mentors. And so I sort of got energized there. And now I want to bring it back to Colorado and to the San Luis Valley. So I'm very honored to be here to share with you the information that I have developed in my research. I was commissioned to write a manuscript for a book entitled The Colorado Acequias of the Rio Grande. And so I just completed the manuscript and submitted it at the beginning of the month. It will take probably another year with the editorial reviews and process. So I'm hoping, if all goes well, maybe by next year, the book might be out in print. And so I think that would be a great addition to the literature and information base for the San Luis Valley. Today, what I would like to do is I would like to share some of the excerpts from my manuscript, mostly dealing with the ethical obligations along ancestral ditches, water justice, and Colorado's hidden Acequia communities. So I'm going to be reading a little bit of narrative at the beginning, and then I want to show you some slides, some visual images of some of the information that I collected and some of the research topics that I explored in my manuscript. So I'll be doing that. And then towards the end, I would like to continue reading some narrative and some excerpts regarding some of the dilemmas that we're facing with some of the issues here in the San Luis Valley, dealing with acequias, existing water policies, but also pathways of how we can address those policies and how we can hopefully move forward in the future to preserve our acequias. So I'll begin with a little bit of a discussion on some of the ethical obligations along ancestral ditches. My research chronicle traces the rarely recognized persistence of Hispano communal irrigation practices across southern Colorado's high altitude Rio Grande headwaters. It presents an implicit yet urgent argument, escalating water management decisions beyond technical calculations over permits, flows, and allocations towards a profound moral reckoning, one elevating water access as an elemental human right, binding shared destiny across natural resources. For in documenting the waves of political and climate instability that arrayed against remote Acequia villages, still nourishing heirloom crops through cooperative snowmelt allotments and spring cleaning rituals learned over generations. Many questions surface on ethical duties to now buffer such communities through an instability that they did not unleash, but which now jeopardizes intergenerational knowledge continuity like never before. Who decides how scarce supplies flow between rural canal networks sustaining ancestral cultivation practices versus metropolitan reservoir diversions where second lawn over irrigation proceeds despite gathering aridity strains? By what ethical calculus does a golf course acreage merit equal priority to acreage sustaining multi-generational farm livelihoods? Do those dwelling in one watershed for over 200 years hold equal rights to self-determination around usage as corporate water speculators, treating hydrology like currency tradable across basins for profit in defiance of ecological boundaries? These questions simmer beneath extensive archival research documenting recurring threats from imported water rights, commodification doctrines favoring urban interests over sustainable rural subsistence flows. As also outlined are accumulating climate impacts from extensive aquifer pumping, deforestation, resort era rural gentrification, gradually eroding fragile customs through demographic and affordability pressures. However, solutions point towards ethical realignment, policies that reassert water as an intrinsic cultural and agricultural lifeline beyond transitional liquid assets. So what ethical foundations can guide state water planning agencies, county managers, and civic partners in decisions that will sustain or displace many Acequia communities in the coming generations as snowmelt cycles falter and aridity advances? Arguably, environmental justice, climate equality, and human rights principles offer logical coordinates, staking the moral high ground around the duty and care across complex change, exacerbating water access challenges. But activation demands reckoning. After all, narrow legal definitions too readily disregard intangible harms like loss of seed-saving knowledge, identity dilution, or household infiltration from imported urban aesthetics, redefining rural reality. For young Hispano descendants of pioneering Acequia families, watching parents forced to abandon irrigated fields for service jobs in distant cities raises questions about belonging, dignity, and cultural continuity, which often overwhelm material security worries, at least initially. A childhood landscape suddenly morphing beyond recognition through concepts alien to one's upbringing triggers wounds not easily quantified by water regulators or census statisticians. And so behind most ethical arguments for sustaining now marginalized biocultural communities often hide more profound appeals for respect, not just financial assistance, but reverence for identity and ways of knowing discounted by dominance paradigms. So amidst gathering environmental strains and uncertainty, evolving conceptions of water justice, climate reparations, and community continuity, it must embrace the dignity interests vital for cultural thriving. This encompasses embracing governance rituals, synchronizing infrastructure changes with gathering equinox timing, or prioritizing native vegetation resilience needs above imported amenity species that are unsuited to wildfire routines or soil health cycles soon disrupted. Long before material deprivation peaks, identity coherence phrase across changing watersheds and social fabrics, and erosion demanding preventative support. Suppose water access stands for cultural continuity across generations before merely volumetric flow. In that case, obligations accelerate around sustaining marginalized Acequia communities as embodiments of profound hydro social resilience, deserving recognition, and revival support through reforms before this precious knowledge fades. For over a century, Acequias and their sophisticated mastery of balancing scarcity, hardship, and uncertainty model a moral blueprint where sustainability leads through shared struggle, an ethical anchor desperately needed amidst society's fragmenting through self-interest, unmoored from collective care and ecological attunement. Colorado's rare Acequia villages stand ready to guide regional regeneration if afforded agency parity rather than dismissal. The time has come. Now I would like to I'd like to show you just a few images of some of the work that I did in my research on the book. First of all, I think we need to look at what is the root of the ancestral waters of the San Luis Valley. And so in doing that, I was looking at the prehistory and the evolution of water in the San Luis Valley. You know, who were the ancient keepers of the waters? How did it evolve? So it's always important to look at the prehistory of the valley. And this is an interesting slide because at one point, all of the basin was a lake. And, you know, for those of us that grow up here in the valley, it's really an interesting concept to think that, you know, this whole basin was full of water at one time. Every time I drive across the San Luis Valley, coming from San Luis to Alamosa, I think about that. And then I also think about the water level. One of the things that kind of helps me keep it in perspective is when I'm driving, I look at Hanson's Bluff right by Los Sauces, and I look at the top because obviously the top of the bluff was the top surface of the water of the lake, according to the research. So, so it's just so important and so amazing to see that the body of water, how it evolved, eventually draining right by Los Sauces into the Rio Grande corridor. I like the slide. It's a 1855 view of New Mexico and Utah. And so as you can see, the San Luis Valley was still part of the territory of New Mexico. And so I like to think that we are still occupied New Mexico. And, and so, so it's a reminder, you know, that the traditions of the Acequia that we just saw in the film have been part of what created the San Luis Valley Acequia systems. So the Rio Grande River obviously is the subject of my work, at least the upper part of it, the headwaters. And so in looking at the Rio Grande, it's a tremendous water resource extending over 800 miles from the San Luis Valley to the Gulf of Mexico. Along the way, it is estimated that there are over 6 million people that are served by the Rio Grande as corridor communities along the waterway. The San Luis Valley, I like to look at it as a valley, but also not in isolation. It's important to look at the valley as it extends into New Mexico because the valley is part of the Taos Plateau. You know, when you look at the Google images, the maps, you can plainly see there's the valley. But beyond the valley, beyond the political boundaries, there's also the Taos Plateau. And I became aware of this in my work with BLM when we were doing the landscape assessment for the potential solar installations here in the valley. We looked at the Taos Plateau as part of the San Luis Valley. And so in my work, I do include it because the physiography of the valley includes parts of the Taos Plateau that spill over into the valley extending nearly up to about Embudo, New Mexico. Also in my work, I also like to look at it as far as a landscape mosaic. My work, especially when I was at Harvard, I was able to pick up a lot of really good concepts from one of my landscape professors, Richard Foreman, who actually came to the Valley a couple times. He really inspired me to look at this whole concept of landscape mosaic, which is basically breaking down the valley into a system where you could classify it as large patches. The big red enclosures there are considered patches, large agricultural patches, along with smaller ones that are scattered throughout the valley. There's also the corridor system, the roadways, the rivers, all of it is all interconnected. And so in order to understand it as a comprehensive landscape, it's important to look at the landscape mosaic. And so I do a whole section in chapter 2 is a discussion of the mosaic, and along with the mosaic, some of the issues that surface that are later on discussed in the last portion of the book. Land grants in Colorado, as Esteban Ariano once said, you can't really understand Acequias unless you understand the deep history of the land grants. And so, as you can see, there was a whole cluster of land grants between northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. For us, the two grants here in the valley are the Sangre de Cristo land grant and the Conejos grant. And then there's other grants that are surrounding us. I also include this migration schematic showing how people from northern New Mexico expanded north between 1790 and 1880. And it's interesting because you can see that the patterns and the roadways show how different portions, for example, in the east end, the people from the San Luis area where I live came mostly from Taos area, Valdez, Mora, that area, whereas people from near Ojo Caliente and other parts, northern New Mexico, Tierra Maria, they migrated through another route that came into Conejos, establishing the community of Guadalupe, San Rafael, so forth, and then expanding further north. This is a view of the Sangre de Cristo land grant, a big chunk of land that basically really was instrumental in privatizing the land grant and setting us into the dilemma that we now experience with water losses, private land loss, etc. It's a large grant, over 1 million acres. The northern part is the Trinchera Estates, and the southern part is Sangre de Cristo, or the Costilla Estates. The Costilla Estates includes most of some parts of northern New Mexico and the San Luis Valley. The image there on the right is a blow up of the Costilla Estates. And it's interesting because along with the Costilla Land Development Company, there were also engineers that were instrumental in helping to look at the landscape, look at the water resources, map them. And so the one map on the right shows how water sources were being mapped, being developed, and even proposed reservoirs were being outlined as a way to harness the water and basically have control over the landscape. I looked at the Rio Costilla, Plaza de Costilla, and that was sort of the beginning of the controversy in many ways, and also the beginning of our water loss because of the fights that occurred. A compact was necessary to be formed in 1946 so that it could also ensure that New Mexico was getting its fair share of water, because the water from the Costilla Reservoir was flowing through the Rio Costilla into Costilla. But then there were also issues because the Costilla States Development Company had purchased most of that land, and so they were very concerned about their portion of the water rights. And so beginning around the time of the compact is when the litigation was launched that led eventually to the Hallett decrees, in which most of the Acequias from Water District 24 lost about half of their water, which went to the reservoir and to the Costilla States Development Company. Rio Culebra Plaza de San Luis was developed around the 1850s. And along with that, we had the San Luis, the People's Ditch, which is the first adjudicated water right in the state of Colorado. Along with that, we also had a roller mill, grain mill that was serving the entire region based on water power for grinding wheat and other grains that were being raised in the area. Conejos was the Guadalupe land grant, which unfortunately was not approved, but it did lead to the development of the next water rights to the People's Ditch, which is the Guadalupe Ditch. Along with the Hispano migration patterns from northern New Mexico, we also had a lot of the early Mormon communities that were coming in around the 1800s. A lot of them were coming in from Utah, and then there was also a movement from New Mexico also coming into the valley. And so I look at some of the early Mormon communities and their water development, their canals and their ditches in the Manassas, Sanford area. Now, at the time that all of this movement was going on and water was being used for agriculture, this is about the time that the state was coming in to develop the whole water adjudication process. And there were the 8 water districts that were formed in the San Luis Valley. And in my work, I look at each water district individually. My whole goal of the research was to look at who had the first water rights in the San Luis Valley, which is obviously most of the Hispano communities because they were the first to pretty much migrate from New Mexico and stake claim to the water rights. So there's 8 different water districts in the valley, and for each of the water districts, there are just hundreds of acequias and ditches. But I also want to clarify, I think we got a pretty good view of what acequias are in New Mexico from the film. But Colorado is a little bit different. There are a few traditional acequias left that still continue to thrive. However, when you look at water, and it's interesting because if you Google ditches in Colorado, you get a bunch of hits. I mean, a lot of information on ditches. But if you Google acequias in Colorado, you'll get some hits, and you'll get a lot of articles that have been written by journals, magazines, technical articles, that sort of thing. And a lot of them are good, they're very informative, but they also try to romanticize the notion of acequias. I mean, it's beautiful, as you saw in the film, but the reality is that we are facing some major challenges that are coming up. Colorado's a little bit different than New Mexico, and so that was my interest in presenting a view of what's going on with water and acequias in New Mexico. Also to clarify, when you mention ditch is basically classified as a private waterway and mostly corresponding to ranches, whereas in acequia, as you saw, it's a way of life, it's a cultural embodiment of the people, the land, and the landscape. And so what is the water resource network for the San Luis Valley? Well, it's really amazing when you look at the natural waterways, and then when you look at the system of acequias and canals, it's pretty much full of water systems. And so for us, it's a challenge to kind of sort through all this, find out which were the traditional acequias, which were the ranch ditches, the canals, and some of the other water developments that have been happening in the valley. In order to sort of put everything into perspective, I developed this timeline of key events that influenced the Colorado acequia traditions. First of all, in the 1800s, we have the Hispano pioneers establishing the first the Rio Culebra, Rio Conejos communities, digging the first community ditches. Then in 1848, we have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where New Mexico territory was ceded to the lands of the United States, and therefore the states were formed and Colorado was formed. 1861, the territory of Colorado was formed upon the discovery of gold deposits. 1870s, Mormon colonies settled the San Luis Valley, digging the irrigation canals. In 1889, the first Rio Culebra water rights decreed, but later slashed under the contentious Hallett decrees that I mentioned. 1890s, there was extensive canal building, which enabled large-scale Anglo-agriculture in the valley. 1938, the Rio Grande Compact signed, mandating downstream flows. 1960s, technology expanded the center pivot irrigations, tapping the aquifer water. And in 2009, we have the Colorado Acequia Recognition Act that passes, which offers some limited protections for acequias. Now we'll address this a little bit further in some of my policy analysis. In the acequia landscape, this is a drawing that I put together to try to show kind of a cross-section. We saw a lot of this already in the film, so I won't spend a lot of time going through it, but it's an interesting cross-section because an acequia encompasses kind of a, in most ideal situations, an ideal slice or transverse section through the landscape, which includes a sampling of all the different terrains, starting from the upper areas to the lower areas to the bottomlands to the bosque, the water cienagas and meadows and so forth. Okay, now this is an interesting situation because we see the traditional acequia landscape, but then we also see around the same time the introduction of advanced water technologies, water speculation. And this came about for Water District 24 in the Sanchez Reservoir ditch system, which was developed in January 1910. Again, it was an attempt to capture the water, put it into a reservoir, and then float it downstream so that the lands that were being sold and wanting to be settled by outside settlers had to have water. And so the water from the Culebra via the Howlett decrees was able to provide irrigation for some of these communities. But over time, because of the drought and arid conditions, these communities did not survive. They are still going, Mesita, Jarosa, Eastdale, they're still irrigating, but at a very limited basis and also subject to the every year challenges of weather and climate change. Center pivot irrigation in the 1950s revolutionized irrigation in the San Luis Valley and led to thousands of irrigated parcels. You could see 2009 and 2023, extensive amounts of center pivot sprinklers. The majority of them are in in the Rio Grande district. And then there's a sprinkling of them through Conejos, a few in Costilla County, and some further north. Along with water development, we also have what we call in the landscape mosaic terminology, disturbances in the landscape. And so I also look at what are some of the threats to the watersheds. Well, a lot of them are subdivisions, obviously. Most of them are extensively developed in Costilla County, where I come from. There's just hundreds of miles of roads that have been platted throughout the Sangre de Cristos. This is a portion of the Sangre de Cristo subdivision, which you can see is sort of encroaching on the agricultural lands of the Fort Garland Blanca area in comparison to the to the acequias that have pretty much faded out from this area. So acequia irrigation is at a crossroads. So how do we proceed from here? I've put together some comments here and a little bit of discussion on how can we realign the hydrosocial contract or policy pathways to revitalizing ancestral ditch democracies. So the policy analysis evaluates the water governance regimes that influence Colorado acequia viability, their historical impacts, and potential alternative pathways to enhance environmental justice. Despite thriving for over 150 years as communal irrigation arteries conveying snowmelt and cultural identity across high altitude Hispano farms, Colorado's low profile acequia traditions now face unprecedented threats from groundwater depletion, demographic shifts, and climate instability, jeopardizing time-honored cultivation cycles. Once anchored across extensive Sangre de Cristo common lands, before the patent privatization enabling logging and subdivision encroachments. These riparian communities embody a profound hydrosocial resilience, deserving recognition and protection through supportive policy reforms before this precious knowledge fades. The policy analysis first synthesizes core challenges outlined across the research undermining Acequia continuity despite profound historical resilience honed through scarcity and hardship. Thereafter, dominant administrative regimes governing ditch functionality are reviewed, highlighting how imported governance paradigms often misalign with traditional customs, incentivizing damage. Finally, alternative modalities better reconciling formal decision-making procedures with inherent communal strength are proposed to enhance environmental justice as climate adaptation necessitates elevating marginalized wisdom traditions aligned with landscape regeneration needs. Colorado's low-profile yet deeply rooted Acequia traditions face mounting pressures across interconnected fronts, destabilizing community irrigation systems that have sustained heirloom agricultural practices for over a century along the San Luis Valley, high-altitude Rio Grande headwaters. Threats range from groundwater tables dropping across aquifers, overtapped by extensive water well networks, towards proliferating ex-urban housing divisions, carving roads and septic systems through once coherent watersheds. The resulting erosion now jeopardizes upstream, downstream connectivity. Meanwhile, waning youth participation, inheritance disputes, fractal cultural continuity, and traditional ecological knowledge transmission, even as climate change brings hotter, drier cycles, disrupting traditional planting patterns. Contemporary threats represent unprecedented scale and complexity, demanding similarly proactive policy responses to secure Acequia viability equal to movement building solidarity. This marginalized demographic is modeled for over centuries simply through the persistence as living waters flowed through collective care despite surrounding uncertainty. Elevating endangered wisdom legacies matters more given the gathering storms. So I would like to discuss the water governance regimes, evolution, and impacts. To contextualize the promise and pitfalls of existing administrative procedures influencing Acequia functionality, we must trace the divergence of governance philosophies as American appropriation doctrine replaced traditional water sharing ethics. Thereafter, implications of later groundwater integration policies and environmental regulatory scopes help explain contemporary management gaps that policy reforms must reconcile. So what are the different philosophies, sharing versus appropriation? To contextualize, whereas traditional New Mexican Acequias enacted water allotment based on cooperative need amidst scarcity managed through governmental rituals around irrigation schedules, American miners quantified volumetric stream flows to exactly partition abstraction permits based on priority claims, earning superior rights. First in time, first in right became codified in Colorado water law by the 1870s based on the use it or lose it principles as unexercised rights faced abandonment, incentivizing maximum diversions. This ethos favors individualized private appropriation for beneficial use, migrated into irrigation context by the 1880s. As extensive canal networks integrated San Luis Valley lands for commercial agriculture, development, and real estate speculation. Hydrology became a commodity earnable through engineering conquest, divorced from community continuity. Traditional water sharing customs endured locally, but were increasingly disregarded in formal administration procedures as wasteful. While surface water adjudications quantified ditch allotments based on infrastructure capacities, the spread of groundwater well drilling, which enabled mechanized center pivot irrigation systems from the 1950s, introduced new complications. Given their dispersed locations and variability, aquifers lacked stream adjudications, visible accountability pressures to restrain withdrawal volumes. Rapid declines in water table levels are drawing domestic wells, soon followed by extensive pumping, showing the bounded supply. The assumptions were wrong. Moreover, stream aquifer interconnectivity meant heavier groundwater pumping often sabotaged senior surface water rights downstream by intercepting subsurface flows before they recharged rivers. But formal regulations lagged behind the groundwater rush until the 1980s. Management integration became reluctantly, and only after state crackdowns faced fierce resistance from agricultural lobbies wary of external constraints on extensive use, enabling their livelihoods even if such withdrawals could not ecologically endure. Governing for sustainability, what are some of the environmental regulations? Well drilling expansions reflected the broader quantitative shift in water governance philosophies away from sustainable collective continuity towards maximizing appropriation for individual interests, now buttressed through technology unlocking vast new frontiers from fossil aquifers to mountain diversion channels. By the 1960s, even boosters viewed natural limits as nearing. Major federal regulations such as the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, and drinking water quality mandates thereafter imposed conservation restraints and discharged pollution controls on rampant development, externalizing damage as the cost of doing business. State-level competency followed around monitoring contamination and issuing well permits. However, uniform national standards often misfit regional realities demanding local participation. Acequia integration outcomes. Unfortunately, such regulatory refinements still discounted traditional water customs as antiquated, despite proven ecological synchrony across functions like seasonal irrigation, attuned to moisture needs, shared by equinox timing or coordinated village cleaning mobilizations that benefit the entire watershed. Neither calculative water market axioms of efficiency nor bureaucratized environmental oversight reoriented the underlying incentives and values enough to regenerate reciprocity ethics core to the communal Acequia identities historically. Gathering aquifer depletion and climate instability spotlights the public costs of policy paradigms still failing to formally elevate ancestral knowledge systems through statutory support, financing assistance, facilitating infrastructure upgrades, or educational programming, fostering youth participation, continuity behind headlines that celebrate obscure persistence without addressing systematic threats. The opportunity costs are enormous as proactive adaptation demands grassroots resilience. Reforms beckon. So what are some of the alternative pathways? If the above analysis confirms how still dominant water governance regimes continue externally undermining and internally discounting Colorado's low-profile yet profoundly wise Acequia traditions through procedural misalignments and philosophical disconnects, what modalities better integrate realities of looming climate disruption with the valley's remaining cultural knowledge reservoirs, demonstrating biocultural resistance despite political marginalization? Well, the following pathways are presented as tentative first steps. First of all, statewide recognition support legislation. As New Mexico statutes offer comprehensive Acequia support, legislation would formally elevate traditional irrigation institutions into governance standing through various provisions granting legal status, financing channels, educational assistance, and technical aid access for democratically run ditch organizations pursuing system improvements or conservation easements shielding watershed lands. Such assistance can come alongside requirements for democratic operational transparency. The 2009 Acequia Recognition Law, amended in 2013, allows Acequias to continue exercising their traditional roles in governing access to water. Still, it needs to go further, such as New Mexico's statutes, Chapter 73, special districts, and Article 2, ditches or acequias. The basin level watershed partnership platforms. Recognizing that acequia coordination across jurisdictional scales and topics often falls through the cracks. State facilitation, encouraging collaborative watershed partnership platforms can better integrate fragmented community forestry, irrigation infrastructure, soil conservation, and environmental stewardship initiatives under locally attuned guidance honoring place-based balance. The Rio Grande Basin Roundtable is an excellent example of valley-wide stakeholder group. County public-private modernization programs. While statewide policy sets strategic frames, regional activation comes from local governments, synthesizing public agencies, businesses, and civic partners, tailored to the unique economic, cultural, and ecological landscape, sustaining the ancestral Acequia viability today. This means participatory modernization, assistance respecting customs, expanded K-12 curriculum content on water ethics, building future generations' appreciation of water as a sacred community lifeline, not purely a divertible commodity or engineering input, starts early through public educational content, integrating water ethics, ditch governance history, and conservation practices into formative learning, blending academic and cultural knowledge. An Acequia curriculum for the schools is currently being developed in the San Luis Valley. Basin-wide Acequia knowledge exchange on adaptation. Too often, wisdom hides in silos, convening platforms for collaborative problem-solving exchanges across ditch organization leaders on response strategies to increasing climate disruptions, utilizes collective intelligence while building solidarity. Regional gatherings can alternate through partnering counties each year to broaden accessibility. The Congreso of Acequias held in San Luis is a good forum, but needs to expand to other valley counties. And finally, state tax incentives for private forest watershed conservation. Unfortunately, such regulatory refinements still discounted traditional water customs such as antiquated, despite proven ecological synchrony across functions like seasonal irrigation, attuned to moisture needs, shaped by the equinox timing or coordinated village cleaning mobilizations benefiting entire watersheds. Neither calculated water market axioms of efficiency nor a bureaucratized environmental oversight reoriented the underlying incentives and values enough to regenerate reciprocity ethics that are core to communal Acequia identities historically. Gathering aquifer depletion and climate instability spotlights the public costs of policy paradigms still failing to formally elevate ancestral knowledge systems through statutory support, financing assistance, and facilitating infrastructure upgrades or educational programming, fostering youth participation, continuity beyond headlines, celebrating obscure persistence without addressing systematic threats. The opportunity costs are enormous, and proactive adaptation demands tapping grassroots resilience. Reforms beckon. Just like to finish up here with a few alternative pathways. If the above analysis conforms, still dominant water government regimes continue externally undermining Colorado's low-profile Acequia traditions through procedural misalignment and philosophical disconnects. What modalities integrate realities of looming climate disruption in the valley? Since Acequia prosperity depends on surrounding forests staying healthy for moderating water cycles, expanded incentives and encouraging large landowners to place acreage under conservation easements rather than harvest could reduce land speculation pressures, degrading upstream connectivity so essential for downstream flow, and aligning private interests with public resilience. The Rio Grande Headwaters Trust and the state lands have initiated numerous conservation easements in the valley. So in conclusion, history confirms Colorado Acequia community's profound resilience despite external political and economic disruptions, erasing common lands and imposing unfavorable water right adjudications. Contemporary resilience now demands collaborative policy pathways, embracing ancestral knowledge systems through legal elevations, youth education and modernization assistance, and cooperative watershed platforms that learn from, rather than silo, low-profile yet supremely relevant cultural capacities accumulated over generations along high-altitude ditch lines. with climate instability threatening state water supplies, rebalancing governance to honor marginalized biocultural relationships, sustaining drought resilience and community continuity brings ethical obligations for reconciliation. The above policy pathways represent initial possibilities for restoring the lost links between water planning, ecological regeneration, and frontline community water equity to meet unprecedented Acequia adaptation needs that have been ignored for too long at the collective peril given the gathering storms. Thank you.